Game Freak, please, 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 stick the landing with Pokemon Legends. I, like many others worldwide, tuned into the Pokemon Presents last month with one big expectation in mind, some gameplay footage from 2024's announced title, Pokemon Legends ZA. I've been a Pokemon fan basically since Pokemon's been around. I was 5 when the first generation of games came to the US, and there aren't a lot of memories I have of a time without Pokemon as a major aspect of my life, and I've gotta say, past Black 2 and White 2, I personally haven't had a Pokemon game be such a hit for me quite like Legends Arceus was. So much of the formula was shifted from the core game experience, the refinement and streamlining of most battles to make them go by in a snap, done to augment the emphasis on catching Pokemon, like population-affecting amounts of Pokemon, to check off a box in your handy-dandy notebook, as well as how you as a trainer interacted with both the world around you and the Pokemon that inhabited it. Like, for example, sneaking around a red-eyed ginormous alpha Pokemon that wants nothing more than to use incredible violence to cause your untimely demise as a middle schooler armed only with a notepad and a pocket full of berries and balls of mud, makes for an equal parts intimidating and hilarious setup for a Pokemon game. And somehow they made it work so well that it's almost weird these kinds of games didn't exist before in the franchise. I know that battling is a major aspect of the Pokemon series, and the competitive scene is massive, but me personally, I like hanging out with my little buddies and going on adventures, enjoying the world and the story, looking for slightly different colored Pokemon to shove away in my PC box and look at from time to time as a source of pride and bragging rights. So the ability to keep so many fundamentals of a mainline Pokemon game and to shift them around to be something new and exploratory and open as opposed to being battle-focused made Legends Arceus a uniquely delightful experience for me. That, and having the ability to see a new wrinkle in a familiar Pokemon region, which can only really be done with a spin-off title like Legends Arceus. So another Legends title held the promise of not only a different experience from a mainline Pokemon title, but also another viewpoint into a familiar setting. A look into the region's history and lore and major events in ways a core title just couldn't otherwise manage. And as a region, Kalos really needed the extra TLC. Like, don't get me wrong, Kalos gave us a lot in Pokemon core game innovations. The 3D visual style that brought a deeper dimension into the world we were playing in, the fairy type which not only shifted game balance but also became home to the best evolution ever and some of the best Pokemon ever, frankly. Gumi, who's just a little guy, horde battles, an interesting mechanic we sort of got back in Legends Arceus, Mega Evolutions, a beloved mechanic to give some love to older Pokemon that unfortunately remained locked to Gen 6, and movement in 8 whole directions instead of just the 4 cardinal directions. Like, I remember people going nuts for that advancement in Pokemon gameplay technology. It was a simpler time, okay? I only played Y the once, and that was when it released in 2013, and from what I remember, the story and world never felt fully realized. Admittedly, following Gen 5 is a futile effort. How does one top peak? But even then, it felt like there were some pretty obvious spots for expansion. For the plot specifically, I felt we needed to know more in relation to both Team Flare's overall motivations and origin, as well as more about the war from 3,000 years ago. And while Zygarde felt comparatively insignificant to the box legendaries, he also got 2 new forms that were first accessible in the generation following his introduction, which was 2 years after the forms were shown off in Korokoro and after they played a part in the X and Y anime, which really just added to the confusion about Zygarde's existence. And then there were bits of oddness in the overworld, like how half-baked sky battles were. Seriously, I forgot about their existence entirely until they were brought up again by the leaks. Which, before anyone mentions it, yes, I've seen the giant Game Freak game leaks, with the noted exception of anything Legends ZA related. I wanted to be surprised, so that's not something I'm going to cover in this video. So, knowing that Kalos was getting the Legends treatment, and knowing that Legends Arceus was set in the distant past, it would have made sense for a Kalos game to take place in the past as well, right? Well... It looks like Legends will take place after the events of X and Y in a modern urban setting. I'll say it quickly because it's a very important aspect to the game, but I'm not someone who usually cares too much about how games work, so long as the frame rate is consistent and there aren't graphical flaws that hurt the eyes and the gameplay and the story still remain engaging. So I'm not offended that the game doesn't look much different, but come on, how did you mess up a shadow on a chair? I've seen some people say the Pokemon models themselves are more cartoony than in Scarlet and Violet, but I was too busy counting pixels in the background that I didn't really notice that, to be honest. That's worry number 1 for me for Pokemon Legends. The whole of Legends takes place within Lumiose City, which is not guaranteed to be a bad thing, of course. It just risks looking bland and highly repetitive given what we've seen so far. Like, the way that the Lumiose City map was broken up in X and Y was already pretty formulaic, you know? We know that now parts of the city are broken up into wild zones as unique Pokemon ecosystems, and those seem to have some visual distinctions from just generic city street whatevers, but that itself seems kinda jarring, doesn't it? Like, just partway through strolling in Paris, there's a small desert that we just accept as a habitat for Pokemon as part of integrating Pokemon in people's lives together? I just don't see it, and maybe it's something that will make more sense as you play the game and the story progresses. But so far it feels not too dissimilar from Blueberry Academy and Scarlet and Violet's second DLC, in that the areas are just kinda divided by a line, which changes the environment into some pretty different biomes without any kind of transition. This really wouldn't be as much of a concern for me if Game Freak wasn't always Game Freakin'. I just worry that this formula means we'll have somewhat monotonous, indistinct cityscapes to wander, broken up by what are essentially parks, which could make the game world feel that much less impactful. Just having the breadth of a larger world doesn't mean that the world is filled with things to do, it just means there's more walking to do between the places that feel more thought out. Width doesn't equal depth, you know? That said, the premise of rooftop travel as another layer to Lumiose City gives rise to other potential aspects of the game we haven't seen yet. For example, even if the game is really truly restricted to just Lumiose City, like the trailer says, it's possible that means we could get the opportunity to explore other layers of the city. Prism Tower comes to mind as a likely candidate for some endgame shenanigans, but I wonder if something like below the city would be possible too. A maze of underground waterways, or a subterranean facility housing a large electrical generator, or any other kind of sublayer to the city. Like, heck, if we're going back to a Gen 6 region, we may as well go back to some Gen 6 concepts. They could bring back the concept of aforementioned sky battles, but with more exploration involved, or even diving on the backs of Pokemon like in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. That could allow for some really unique adventures, maybe giving some more opportunities for distinct encounters with mysterious Pokemon that are rare or even new to the Kalos region, tying in some way to the overall plot of the game. Maybe recent memories of Tears of the Kingdom is giving me more expectations for these kinds of open titles, but I digress. I just think of towns like Messagosa and Scarlet and Violet with the copy-pasted buildings and swath of needlessly spread out yet repetitive shops, and I worry that we're just going to get that kind of layout copied and pasted over and over and over again as the skeleton of the map. And it's not like Messagosa was the only town plagued by a photocopier gone rogue either, it was just the largest, most central example in those games. Anyways, my hope is that Legends veers away from the monotony at every possible opportunity. It's fine for the city's architecture to look consistent in some aspects and areas, but variety in the vast wildlands available to explore in Legends Arceus being the predecessor to a title centralized entirely in one city leaves the expectations bar pretty high. Adjacent to the setting and exploration is the Pokemon interactions, namely catching and battling. Some of the most fun aspects of Legends Arceus were the ways that you could catch a Pokemon, luring or stunning them using items, sneaking up on them, things like that, which was a brilliant innovation. If the expectation was to catch ecosystem-shattering numbers of Pokemon, the act of catching them should be engaging too. And it was fun! Except, of course, when the Pokemon you wanted to catch was on a slight incline, then it was impossible and kind of bullshit, actually. But very generally, it was a fun and engaging core gameplay loop. From the 5 seconds we saw of catching Pokemon in the trailer, it looks similar so far. Granted, a city isn't as environmentally diverse as a sprawling plain, so it doesn't look like it would have the same feeling as sneaking up on a Pokemon through tall grass, looking down from a vantage point, or running frantically when being spotted. The street we see the player character catch a wild Pokemon in does have some foliage, but again, the city design worries me here in that the wild zone is, for all intents and purposes, apparently a city street that's just walled off on both sides. To be fair, and to definitely not cope, this could be a starting area designed to railroad the player into one of those classically unskippable 2-hour-long Pokemon tutorials where you can't really mess up. I mean, even the minimap suggested at least curves around a little further on, but it's not a great first impression compared to even the beach tutorial in Legends Arceus, let alone the Obsidian Fieldlands. A huge part of the appeal of not only Obsidian Fieldlands, but most all of the areas in Legends Arceus was that there were layers to them. Areas that, until you got a new mount or story beat, you couldn't access. So seeing a fairly linear city street and a couple of rooftops that are also fairly linear is, well, what's the opposite of hype? Ippia? It's Ippia. Tangent, but I'd put money on the fact that the person that lives in the apartment just below this rooftop works night shifts and is sick and tired of trainers battling their giant hippo Pokemon against hawks just above his bedroom every single day. Like, you know that's absolutely the case, right? Anyway, speaking of battling Pokemon, another highlight of Arceus was how standard Pokemon battles were way sped up. Again, a slight necessity with so many of the research tasks being watch Bidoof use Growl 400,000 times, but also kind of a luxury in progression, since battling was more of a backseat to exploration and Pokemon collecting. I like that you could generally one-shot Pokemon, even in some trainer battles. Conversely, that left your Pokemon open to being one-shot by attacks, which added the layer of risk and reward in the agile and strong style moves. Do you gambit a strong style attack? attack to try and get the KO in one turn, or would playing it safe first with an agile move to get a slight boost to your stats or apply a status effect to the opposing Pokemon give you the better advantage? That tactic applies even more when you have a group of wild Pokemon attacking you all at once. But from the trailer, Legends seems to be taking a totally different approach. Though it looks really fun, I can't lie. Being able to do real-time Pokemon battles has been something fans have been aching for a long time. The battle system itself looks really similar, to me at least, to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3 especially, where you have your set attacks on cooldown after use. It looks like if you swap out a Pokemon mid-battle, the newly selected Pokemon's moves will all be charged up, which could be a boon, especially for harder fights. I'm curious then how other aspects of battles will work. Things like accuracy. Since you're directing your Pokemon around in real time, would they be able to dodge certain moves? If I'm remembering right, Gen 6 was when Pokemon avoiding mortal danger or dodging attacks they normally wouldn't be able to due to their love for you started as a mechanic, so it could be something they bring back here? But what about status conditions? Will they be something that trigger randomly over time, or will they fade as the battle continues? Legends Arceus altered things like sleep to drowsiness, akin to the paralyzed status where sometimes you can attack and sometimes you can't, and being frozen to frostbite, which gave chip damage, more like a poisoned or burned status. Paralysis and drowsiness have the potential to be super annoying if they're not modified again. Like, it would be one thing if your Pokemon stopped every so often due to status conditions, which I'm sure for most of us would just look and play like regular old Pokemon jank, so we might not even know that our Pokemon are hurt. But what if your Pokemon is paralyzed and just can't move? That seems like a death sentence, especially if there's the potential to aggro a bunch of Pokemon at once again. Like, how do you counter this? Anyways, I'm also interested to see what, if anything, the positioning of attacks affects in battle. Again, I'm Xenoblade pilled, so I can only imagine the shenanigans you could get up to if, say, attacks that hit from behind cause different effects in battle, or even what Mega Evolutions might add to battles outside of being really strong and cool as f***. On the topic of battling, though, I noticed there were a lack of alpha Pokemon in these trailers. I guess for a city setting where Pokemon are supposed to live alongside humans, having a Goodra Godzilla would be less than ideal for maintaining the peace, but the alpha Pokemon and the noble Pokemon battles especially were such a cool wrinkle to Legends Arceus that it feels like a missed opportunity to not have something similar to that in Legends. Again, and I can't stress enough how cope this is not, just because we haven't seen something doesn't mean it's not in the game to discover. After all, we kinda don't really know what the main conflict of the game is yet, and something like Pokemon going goblin mode and causing mayhem in the city would be a reasonable assumption to make as a plot point we could see. It would just also kind of be a bummer to not have those battles with the sense of scale and gravity to them that Alpha and Noble Pokemon gave in Arceus. I'm excited either way to play around with the new battle style, and I'm hoping especially that in the wild zones or really anywhere that has lots of Pokemon around, battles with wild Pokemon keep the smooth transitions in and out of exploration that Arceus had, having the combat augment the adventuring in a streamlined way. Less of a stop and go and more of a pause and go, you know? Finally, sort of related to the current lack of conflict, we really don't know much about the story at all. Which is good. Going into a game knowing the entire story before it unfolds is kind of a hype sniper, but of course we gotta speculate a little bit too, right? For example, are we going to be doing something similar to Legend Arceus' field research and filling in the first Pokedex ever with the urban Pokemon? Will there be research tasks in a similar vein where you need to see and interact with tons of Pokemon to get data and report back to the hotel with your findings? Or will it be an entirely new system? It feels like there's the potential to go in a similar direction with Arceus' Pokedex data gathering, but in a modern setting there would already be a standard Pokedex, one would assume. A friend of mine pointed out that the male protag's default hairstyle has bangs that are pretty close to Professor Sycamore, which to me could mean one of two potential story points. One, we could be Sycamore saplings in this game. Like, let's face it, look at this man, he probably kisses a lot of people all of the time, every day, forever, so it's not impossible that he'd have kids that were old enough to adventure around the Pokemon world 13 years post X and Y. And it would also give a reason for the player character to not just travel to Lumiose City for tourism. It could be for continuing research, like to your old dad in his absence. Another option is a sort of related speculation is that we're meant to become like a Pokemon professor in this game. And that's why there's remnants of a former professor's design on the player character, even if we aren't baby Sycamores. That could maybe tie into urban or towny, urbane or tawny, being the foil to whatever default trainer you choose to be, but with Trix yogurt-colored hair instead. Perhaps a rival professor in the making? Perhaps a long-lost half-sibling of the kisser of everyone? Or just the Akari or Ray to your player character in Arceus? Probably the last one, but it's kind of fun to speculate. Speaking of player characters, customization being introduced in Gen 6 was delightful, and I'm sure its inclusion in Arceus means we'll have it in Legends too, but I really want to see refinements. For example, choosing the default male character in X and Y gave the player significantly fewer options in hairstyles and clothing than the default female character. Like, look at this is just egregious. This can be easily rectified in Legends if Game Freak stop being silly little goobers and just let people customize however they want forever and for always. Additionally, if we could fix that thing in Legends Arceus where there's a list of all possible color options of all possible articles of clothing as a list instead of letting the player pick a color after trying on a shirt or whatever, that would be so much cleaner. Like, you can just put a box next to the clothing piece with color palettes or Pokemon motifs or whatever that players could select from instead of scrolling for 10 minutes at a time to pick a new outfit. I won't even charge you. You don't even have to credit me. That idea is free, Game Freak. Just do it. Good lord. Jumping back to characters though, I'm curious if, since this is a modern adventure, we'll see aged up versions of other friends we made in X and Y. It'd be really cool to see Calum and Serena, for example, or maybe our 500,000 rivals that were in those games, and characters like Clement and Diantha who would likely be floating around in Lumiose anyway. Taking a bit of a deeper cut, it would be nice to see a little bit more about this suspicious lady as well. I'm really curious about the rehabilitation of this tall lad though. Not that 13 years isn't a long time to reflect on one's actions, though for him that's kind of a drop in the bucket, I guess, but if I remember right, I'm pretty sure this guy was the one to make a machine that was capable of doing a world-ending explosion, and they're letting him run a hotel now. There's gotta be more to that story, and it would be kind of odd to not see other familiar faces to help tell that story. And finally, before I tie a knot on this one, I've seen a lot of back and forth on why the starter Pokemon we got were the ones we got. This is just my take on it, but I think Gens 2, 5, and 7 did need a little TLC for their starter mons in recent times, so the choices fit nicely, in my opinion. Not that other gens don't need the love. I do think the starters from Gens 4 and 6 also need some TLC, and I suppose it's not impossible that new forms don't exist in Legends for the Kalos trio, but Generations 2, 5, and 7 getting representation in their starters in Pokemon Legends Arceus made a lot of sense to me, and it would have made a lot of sense to see here too, just because their starter Pokemon as a whole haven't really gotten the same amount of attention as other generation starter Pokemon. That, and that Totodile is the best starter ever, he's just a chompy little lad who wants to party. What's not to love? Of course he deserves to be here. Overall, I'm cautiously optimistic about Pokemon Legends. From what we see and what we know now, we can really only speculate how in-depth the experience will be and how polished of a game it will end up as, at least until we get more promotional materials leading up to release. I know I've joked around and been a little harsh on Game Freak, but it's all from a place of love for Pokemon. I want these games to be good. I want these games to succeed. And I want the series to be held to a higher standard for all the financial resources that Game Freak and the Pokemon Company have to work with. Like, there's really not a lot of excusing the visual and performance issues plagued by recent titles, and I'm not usually a huge stickler for that. I love myself a janky game, I just also really want the game to be polished. I also really want to see the game worlds and gameplay be as engaging as Legends Arceus. If the world really is smaller and limited to just Lumiose City, then I hope the experience is as tight-knit as possible. Putting details into buildings and streets that make it feel like a truly lived-in urban area full of unique nooks and crannies. Hoping for the best, bracing for the Game Freak. As long as they make it another excellent experience like Arceus, I'll be happy, but I'm always gonna hope for more. After all, 12-ish years on, it'll be nice to come back to the Kalos region, with the major focus on Lumiose City. Well, as long as they pre-patch out any game file breaking glitches when saving in Lumiose City this time around. And for God's sake, bring back the shiny Pokemon jingle. Why would you take away such a universally good feature for missable Pokemon? Thank you all for watching. What are you most looking forward to with Pokemon Legends? What are your hopes and your worries for the title? Which starter are you gonna go with, and why is it Totodile? I'd love to chat with everyone in the comments below. Until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and stay well. Take care. Bye.